here we are. So, Anthony, can I ask you? I mean, there is so much to talk about. Let me just say that the last tickets for a live performance that I bought and did not use were for you and Justin Vivian Bond at Joe's Pub. And I have kept all through the pandemic those printed out tickets on my desk as a talisman of the past and the future.
Well, that makes me so happy. I mean, believe it or not, that project has kept me going through this whole pandemic. It has morphed and changed, but I'm hoping when we come out of the pandemic fully, that will be one of the first things that you can come see. So, but similarly, I was thinking back to my, what has kept me alive during the pandemic, and I took off my bookshelf all of my Wayne Koestenbaum books that I don't have the full set. But now I'm very excited. I feel like we're doing an infomercial, which we're not, but I'm very excited to have this new collection, which has been keeping me afloat for the past couple of weeks since I got it. So it's amazing.
Very great. I'm grateful to be in your hands. And I remember when we first met at that now defunct Raffaello's on 9th Street or something, I might have signed a copy of my opera book to you. You were so young. We were both younger then, but you were so young. I think you were in the first efflorescence of your adult fame.
That makes me feel like a sea creature or something. My
No,
just the fluorescence has dimmed slightly, but
not
I have it, and I had you sign my original college copy, which is this one with all of the little bookmarks of the Queen's Throat, which is a seminal text still, I feel like, for either a queer person or an opera person or someone who studies culture. And I was thinking about, as I was reading the new one, The Cheerful Scapegoat, what I mean, I don't know. Have you written fables before? When I was going to bed as a kid, my dad used to read me Calvino, being the Italian dad that he was. And so you have this very characteristic voice, but it's something I first encountered in the Queen's Throat, and now encountering it in the context of this kind of narrative fictional thing, I started to think, what makes a fable and not a story? Is there a moral? I mean, what is it?
when I was a kid, I had nothing as sophisticated as Calvino's fables or whatever, but I did have Andrew Lang's fairy tale books. I don't know if you know those. They each had a different. They're kind of late Victorian, early 20th century British compilations of classic fairy tales, but each book was a different color. So and they're called by the name of the color. So it's the yellow fairy book, the red fairy book, the purple fairy book, and so I think of that as my first adventure in synesthesia on the one hand, but I think I was interested as a kid in fairy tales before I was interested in opera or in theater either. But I think that the world of fable and the world of opera are coterminous in a very, is there any role that you have appeared in, or is there any even aria you've sung that is not fabular? Even Summertime?
Yeah. No, it's very true. And just as you were saying that, and as someone who savors language, when you were saying fairy tale, I was thinking back to that show with Justin Vivian Bond, which we're adapting. And of course, I sing an excerpt from The Fairy Queen, and Vivian sings There Are Fairies at the Bottom of Our Garden. And why would a fable be called a fairy tale? You know what I mean? Is it because they had so many fairies in them?
Right. No, I know fable is a more punitive sounding or ethical word than fairy tale gives license to pure fancy and acts of self-levitation, and necromancy, my favorite word other than
What does
chartreuse.
that mean, necromancy?
Necromancy is what it magic basically. But I think necro, like necrophilia or necropolis, does have to do with death. So I think there's something about necromancy that involves conjuring with the dead.
Mm.
Orpheus. I mean, among other things. But I wanted to ask you very particularly, what are you planning to do with Justin Vivian Bond? Can you say anything about
Yes,
this?
I think I can. I think I can. I, you know, Justin Vivian Bond as an icon, really, of performance, of, the queer universe. I didn't understand what they were until about 10 years ago when I went to a performance. And I thought, never in a theater have I seen anything this stimulating. And I realized later on, as we became friends and occasionally would perform together, that there was a very special energy in which I look the way I look and sing the way I sing, which is very high and different than I look. And they look the way they look and sing the way they sing, which is very low and different. And so there was a kind of high low dichotomy, not only in the tessitura and the height, but also in the echelon of culture in the way it's perceived. That as we mashed up our worlds, it started to reveal things about the what Vivian calls the bulwark of classical music, and this sort of foreboding wall, and also the depth of popular music, or the sort of political subversiveness of cabaret and how that can interface with classical music. And so we started to think about Julie Andrews and Carol Burnett at Carnegie Hall and their kind of high-low world, in which Julie Andrews was a wonderful musical comedy actress, and Carol Burnett would come on and go, "Huh?" And so there was that world that we wanted to explore, which was then carried on to Beverly Sills and Carol Burnett at the Met once, which, if you haven't seen on YouTube, is wonderful. So we started to put together these different songs, and I started thinking about being someone who is queer and being a classical musician. Now, often in a wonderful way, people say, I'm gay or I'm queer and I'm a classical musician. There are many of those people. But I don't know that it is even still right now accepted for you to express your queerness in classical music somehow. I don't know. Maybe people do that, or maybe it's indirect. But there was something about this juxtaposition, this looking at the relationship of pitch and gender, of high and low, and the repertoire, which was so camp and yet so deep. I mean, how do we move that expression of queerness in something as foreboding as classical music forward?
It's such a very profound question because, to paraphrase it, one part of it is not that one's queerness is not merely does not have a merely contingent or accidental or circumstantial relation to one's expressive art, but that it is in fact pivotal to it. Then the question remains, how much within one's authorial control is the switch of the gayness or the queerness of expression? And I wonder, just taking my sense of your vocalism and performance into account, I have a sense quite uniquely in your performances that you are in command of a switch where you choose when you're going to turn on the spigot of conscious gender fuck, conscious confusion, when you're going to actively, I don't keep on wanting to say actively, let's say when you passively also wish to tumble around the categories. I would wager that your relation, I'm just making this up right now, Anthony, that you take in a way, the syntax or the lexicon of vibrato, and that you make a decision, an unnerving decision, helped by Philip Glass often, but not just Glass, where you're going to make it more piercing, make it more uncanny, make it more placeless with regard to the customary homes of gender within the vocal body.
Mm. That's so interesting. I do feel that those choices happen. But what I want to ask you about is those choices are a combination for me of a kind of rigor in preparation, which means that I rehearse and rehearse and rehearse in the technical sense, in the musical sense, and also rehearse the choices I might want to make, such that in the moment of execution, I can retain a kind of impetuousness or freedom, which can exist within a spectrum I've determined, but so it's not totally wild, but it has a kind of spontaneity, which is exciting. When I read your sentences, I sense the same kind of thing, but writing strikes me as a kind of practice in which the execution is closer to the preparation. The execution isn't so much a moment of performance, although maybe for you it is, I don't know. But I'm curious how much impetuousness or spontaneity exists in one of your sentences and how much rigor it's balanced by.
Well, it's such a great question, and particularly if I start to think of it as the process of writing, the preparation and the execution and the revision as analogous to the process of performance. I think that for me, even in a first draft, the moment I step into syntax, the moment I step into communication, even the most abstruse and esoteric forms of communication that I stumble into all the time without, I can't help it. I'm confusing. I just get confusing the minute I open my mouth. But I think that the minute I am within a sentence, I'm within an orbit of urgencies and rules that to some extent leave me in a position of caginess, wiliness, like Puck, like having to be, uh, or Ariel in a way, like having to be the limber and defensive against the bulwarks of grammar. And so that even again, even in a first draft, once I enter a sentence of any kind, I am in a defensive, strategizing posture. But I was thinking one more thing about this that I want to say, Anthony, is about questions of sforzando, portamento, vibrato, attack. I mean, pitch variation, all the ways that one signals intention or arrival within a classical music phrase, not improvised or not, seeming, whether there are analogies in language to those forms of, the signature mark of an aesthetic choice in music,
Mm.
like a sforzando or a staccato, where there's a sense not only that it's staccato, but that the artist has chosen staccato or is rendering the staccato with an individuating force.
I absolutely think so. And I think back to your book, the best-selling Jewish porn films of poetry. Um, Everyone should read it. But I feel like what you do in a poem, and you do it to a certain extent, even in the fables as well, is that you construct the arc of a sentence, but also in conjunction with the arc of a larger piece, whether it's a story or a poem, a kind of clarity in terms sometimes of short words, which to me are the sort of sforzandi or the staccati or the pizzicati, and then these, as you say, these kind of deep murky pools of larger words that make you go like, which are very stimulating, but they also can be like quicksand. They can sort of draw you to them, and then you come out often with a kind of banal clause, which serves to kind of clear our palate and also focus our thinking. So it seems to me that you play with these dynamic elements as much, but I think like any performer, part of it is your natural disposition, however you've arrived at that, to taste and style and things like that. And part of it is a more sort of callous, like, laborious process of, configuring things. In writing, I think it's often referred to as the voice, interestingly enough. Like, what is your voice? Whereas in singing, it's not really referred to, meaning in music, it's more the word identity that comes through in voice. So I'm going to use the word identity, but like, how do you feel you express the same identity in any kind of writing? Or do you feel like you have different identities you express that are permutations of you?
Anything I want to say, even if it's to describe a Philip Glass, a moment in Philip Glass piece, or a Bernini sculpture or your shirt, which I really would like to describe in detail and interrogate you about a lot.
It's complex.
Major parenthesis for that, that I want that I often, since language is my primary métier, that I want that act of thinking to happen in language, and I want to lean into language the way I know how. Usually not from a position of like, I know what I'm going to say, but position of like feeling up or groping language, leaning into it, testing it here, testing it there. I like the feeling of it happening in words. I like it happening interpersonally,
Mm.
which is why I think I often, a lot of the things I've written have come from assignments of some kind, like when we collaborated, oh, so many months ago at Caramoor, and it was going to be the LA Opera on our Veils piece together, where you just said, Wayne, will you write some poems for us for this occasion? And it was, in that case, yeah, language was the thing that I could bring to the ensemble, but it was your invitation and soliciting of my voice that was what gave me the energy. So I wanted to ask you, in terms of Callous, since I've just, and interpersonality and identity, I've just finished reading a perplexing and beautiful little book, a psychobiography of Maria Callas by Paul Wink, published by Oxford University Press. And I was a little scornful, like psychobiography, but I read it and I thought, so interesting. And he talks particularly about the question of merging with an audience and with her roles. And I was thinking of Judy Garland, and I was watching some of your performances, and I was wondering, since you're mentally very stable as performers go, so you're a trustworthy witness. What would you say about the psychological issues of merging and identification with audiences, with applause, with collaborators, with maestri, and impresarios, with teachers, with your own voice, with your image?
It's a very good question. And I've actually thought about it a lot in the pandemic because there's been the absence of all of these things. So it's been a good time to think about them. One thing that struck me, which is really dumb, so you'll allow it, but is the root of the word is the same in community and communication. And I feel like what I enjoy most with an audience is communication. And for me, it happens most acutely, not so much in the applause, which is one thing. That's more an act of community to me. The act of communication happens in the total silence, because silence takes a kind of really strict participation. And the bigger the audience, like if there are 4,000 people in a house like the Met, when people are paying attention and being totally silent. And so, much has been said about me entering completely naked in Akhnaten. But part of the excitement of that happening early on in the trajectory is that if you do it right, which is actually difficult, if I enter and am kind of nervous and shifty in my shoulders or anything like that, there's no silence at all. Instead, the audience is turning to each other and going, in fact, I have to tell you this slight digression. When I first entered naked at the English National Opera, I was terrified that, people would take photos and put them online and everything. I mean, not terrified. I figured it would happen, but
Hope.
oh, one could hope. So, and so the first opening night, I walked on, imagine I've had my body waxed and my head shaved, and I walk on, they reveal me, I walk on totally naked and down this flight of stairs, and all I'm seeing is these flashes in the audience. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, people are taking pictures with a flash. This is so strange. Um, and in fact, I came to realize that it wasn't camera flashes, but rather when you have a pair of opera glasses and you raise them, they catch the light and they flash in the light. So I was seeing people raise their binoculars and their opera glasses. But what I learned from that and what I used those flashes to do was to be totally still and totally focused in such a way that the audience couldn't pick up their opera glasses. They couldn't turn to their neighbor and say, like, hey, look at that. They felt compelled to be completely just frozen with me. And in that second, it's like a vacuum. It's like a sous vide machine sucks all the air out of the room, and everyone just goes like, and that's a very, very, very exciting kind of communication that feels really very rarefied. I mean, there's nowhere that happens in the world except in a theater. And it, I don't know what it does exactly, but I've come to understand in the past year that it does a lot. It's actually a very important thing. And the in terms of the auxiliary people, the sort of maestri and all of that, in order to achieve the sous vide effect on stage, you have to arrive at weeks, if not months, of this kind of community building that I, on some level, find kind of tiring or, overly, my inner, introvert finds it exhausting or, kind of trite in a way. Like when you walk into a room and a director says, oh, we're going to do a group improv, you think, oh my God, I can't bear something like that. But in fact, it builds community in a way, and this, not to sound totally cliche, but a sort of trust that enables in the moment, that in that ephemeral moment of sous videing, everybody to operate as one, and therefore the audience can join into that group. I don't know if that answers the question.
Oh my God. First of all, the sous vide effect is a book. It's your book. I'll ghostwrite it if you get lazy, but I mean, really, the sous vide effect, I want it in my life. The book that you're going to write called Sous Vide Effect, the lecture series, the podcast, but I also want the experience you're describing happens as well for the audience, for me, not just from my position in the audience, but from my position of identification with the singer or actor producing the sous vide. The way, and I'm thinking of all the great moments in the theater or even the cinema in a way that and it's when you feel the authority of a performer mesmerize everyone, you're happy to be mesmerized, but you're also gratified to know that there's available in the world that command function for perhaps metaphorical use later. It's not like you get the sous vide on you when you walk on nude and you say, wow, I'm going to walk on nude in front of 4,000 people after having trained my voice for 20 years. That's not going to happen, but you can export from that theatrical experience into a small venue of your own, maybe even just that night at dinner. You know what I mean? You can, I don't know. It's a kind of tutelage or like a sentimental education. It's a authority education that the sous vide effect provides.
An authority education. I like that in terms of your ability to command and your ability to lead. It's kind of like a messiah complex in a way, but isn't writing in some way the same thing? Like if you're writing a scholarly article, you kind of have a thesis, right? And then you have to sort of prove it or provide substantiation or ask questions, but ultimately that are used to sway people toward your way of thinking. Is there ever a time that you have a kind of reverse command in which you write something, or have you encountered writing like this, which actually is structured to alienate someone into the opposite way of thinking?
That's so interesting. I don't know if I can answer yet that last part of that question, but I want to say in relation to an earlier part of the question that the sous vide effect, or an earlier implication of what you were saying, the sous vide effect in writing does not happen interpersonally with an imagined reader, or even if I'm reading a piece out loud at a reading, which is in a way a very ancillary event to the scene of writing or even the scene of reading, as opposed to performance, which is always about the performance, that I can feel, particularly around diction or word choice, as a reader and as a writer, when there's a moment of felicitous word choice and a word lands in its grammatical slot. And it's not just le mot juste, but it's maybe the weirdest word ever. But it's the word that has been individually put there. And that act of placement in regard to the whole body of the language performs a sous vide. If that makes sense, it's like, it's as if that you, so it's not the audience is language itself or textuality or the books you've read or your imaginations of people's inner reader as they're reading your book or here, but a word lands. And you know, I'm thinking of a phrase that Susan Sontag used in an essay about Elizabeth Hardwick, praising this sous vide capacity of Elizabeth Hardwick. And she refers to Hardwick's hot lexical choices. Now that, to say hot lexical choices is doing a sous vide number on everyone in the outside world who doesn't get Sontag and Hardwick.
Yeah, yeah. It's so succinctly too. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. I wonder if you when you've probably been asked this so many times, but you have a command of certain words that occur to you that I would say almost no writer I've encountered does. And so just to ask a simple question, where did these words come from and how do you uncover them in your own subconscious or conscious, and but how does one access that kind of vocabulary?
Well, one easy answer is the dictionary. It's all there. It's so easy, as opposed to the issues of voice. Schubert could write an F in the, right below middle C, but singing it is an utterly, and particularly that's actually the weirdest thing I think about, say, playing an instrument like the piano versus being a singer, is that this is a kind of a digression suddenly, but it really does fascinate. You can look at a score and the notes are conceptually very simple, but they can be anatomically impossible for you.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, I think of, even like a Mozart, like Dove Sono or something, like a classic, like Mozartian, perfect, simple. It's there. There's nothing. It's just those notes, but it is but as opposed to language there is no, words are there for the taking. And I would say circumstantially or autobiographically in my life, I have a weird relation to vocabulary, probably because of my mother's father, who was an English teacher at Abraham Lincoln High School in Flatbush, and as well as a bit of a Latin teacher and the dean of boys, a very punitive dean of boys. He was not a very nice man, but he, as a kind of hobby and secondary vocation, he coached people for the SATs. And he wrote dozens of books with names like Building Word Power. And he would send these to me, and he was quite hectoring to me in my childhood and adolescence about preparing for the PSATs, the SATs, getting into college, all these things around vocabulary. And he had a whole theory of, you have to know Latin, you have to know the Latin roots, and he had these word lists that he would send me. And I think that in a way, then the culture of language my mother grew up in that household was very comfortable with the fanciest ways to put things.
That's so interesting. But are you said, he wasn't a nice man, and yet he kind of provided this crucial piece of your, DNA in a way. I'm curious if I will just say I have a similar lineage. Everyone's asked, oh, your parents musicians? No, they are psychologists and were psychology professors. But the only musician in my family that I know of, I never met, which was my grandfather on my mother's side. And he was apparently a very successful child prodigy classical violinist. And apparently he played he played in Carnegie Hall a recital like when he was 18 or something. And he was also a kind of terrible person. But the story I know to be true is that in his early 20s, he was driving his mother to a concert somewhere, and they got into a car accident, and she died. And he never picked up the violin again. And he was a terrible person, and there's all this kind of strife around the creation of it, and yet the musical seed, which is my entire life, may have kind of come from that. Do you experience a similar kind of cognitive dissonance?
I do. I mean, I don't think that my grandfather, I wouldn't want it on Zoom record forever that I'd say he wasn't a nice person. He had a bossy disposition. He had a bossy disposition and was very old fashioned. And I think the question that this raises for me, that's slightly a detour, but that I wanted to think about with you, is talent, which
Mm.
I grow more and more to believe doesn't exist as such. Of course, I think you have to be in the right place to receive certain gifts of instruction, and perhaps you have to have some physical or mental givens of a neurological system, an anatomical system, whatever. There are certain givens that it's not like like this Fitbit can't suddenly sing Rosalinda. You have to be a human being for one, and you have to have training and all that. But given that, I am not positive that talent is the best word to describe the thing that produces an adult artist. And so I wonder, and so as we're tracing our talent or whatever to creepy people in our past, or not creepy, but just whatever, mixed bags. I just wonder what you think about this issue, particularly in the world of classical music, where both talent and training loom huge. It's not like beat poets, you know.
Yeah, I completely agree that I think talent is so overrated. And I think that, in fact, it's more than overrated. And I'll bring it back to Callis for a second. There are some singers who are so naturally gifted that it's actually, there's very little resistance that they encounter from their own bodies, from their mind, from their psyche, from the world. And therefore, there is, in a way, so little struggle. And I find those performers very uninteresting on stage, generally. Then, if you look at someone like Callis, who, of course, I identify with greatly, she was struggling. I mean, from a very young age, not only with her voice, but often with her voice, also with her weight and with love and with, being accepted. And then she reached this kind of height, but there was the struggle present in every note she sang. People say, why do I find it so compelling when she sings? Well, in a way, I think it's because the struggle was there. And also, in the moment she had the kind of um, exacting, perfection. I hate the word perfection, but a kind of exacting nature to her singing. It was because she had struggled so much that she had beat it into herself, which is something I also do, because I don't feel that my natural instrument, perhaps somewhat like a callus or something like that, was so extraordinary, or is so extraordinary, that it didn't need much work. It needs so much work that it's a daily struggle for me, and that struggle is somehow communicated in performance in a way which is much more engaging than if I met very little resistance. But the one counterpoint to that, as you know, I have this great voice teacher who I've had since I was 16, and her name is Joan Patino Jarnell, and she has scarves and perfume, and is of a certain golden age. And she talks in a very particular way. And she said to me one day, "Oh no, dear, you must not do the high note like that. You must approach it in this way and that." And I responded to that, saying, "Okay, yeah, I'll try." And she said, "No, dear, don't try. Allow." And I thought, that on some level is the kind of the dance I'm always doing between the struggle in one context and then walking on stage and being able to allow.
I so identify with I wish I had had a Joan in my life to say allow, but I do this. I definitely, despite my grandfather and his word power, I think in college and even in throughout my 20s, I think till really the end of my 20s, I didn't have very much self-confidence at all as a writer, and I never felt I felt volcanic, but I didn't feel talented.
Mm.
I mean, I felt I had a huge amount of energy and devotion to my inner life and a craving to lean into language to express that and a sense of being feeling enormous fervor and also very easily inspired by anything, particularly music, but anything, and wanting to make that happen in language, but not talented. I felt like, and I still feel that there some of the natural ways I express myself are intrinsically clumsy, not fluent, backwards, messy, ungrammatical, unpunctuated, certainly. If I had my druthers, I wouldn't punctuate ever. So, but I had many rich, particularly in my 20s, which I think of as the years of my self-invention. It's kind of like Callas in Athens singing Cavalleria Rusticana at like 18 or something like that, 19, 17, 13. Do we even know?
I
But
don't know.
I did have a sense of punishing and or just submitting myself to extra amounts of rigor that couldn't imagine other writers did.
Yeah,
Well, I'm
I
sure they did. I'm sure many of them did, but which had to do with number of revisions, punitive attitude toward even a decent draft, all these sorts of things.
that I mean that was is all expressed in this, kind of journey to where we are now. But one thing I like that Joan actually is another Joan thing she asks her young students, but I want to ask you now at this, you're in a kind of exalted place in life, right? You might have invented yourself in your 20s, but then you've kind of you've published 20 books and, all of this. If you had a magic wand and could change one thing about your craft,
Mm.
what would it be?
The answer I'm going to give might not be true, meaning that the answer that popped into my head, I don't know whether I would really wish this to be the case. I often wish that I could figure out a bit more what I mean to say before I start stumbling into saying it.
Hmm.
That would make the process of writing and revision less labyrinthian, but it might make it less playful, and it would deprive me of the naughty feeling that I always have of being an interloper and a bull in a china shop,
Yeah.
and it would also deprive me of the amounts of self-surveillance and self-discipline and self-editing that come from my knowledge that there will be an unthought out quality to what I put down.
Do you approach your art making, because now you've been painting and drawing and taking photos and colorizing things and all of that, do you approach it in the same way you approach your writing in that sense, or is it more free, more focused, less focused?
It's more free. Thank you for asking that. It's more free because I'm not trying to enter the world via that gate, so that I don't need to rely on the judgment and the gatekeeping of others as much. So in the period of my 20s at least, it wasn't just that I had exacting standards. It was clear to me everywhere in the world around me that there were editors and entrepreneurs who were making decisions about who was a good writer, and that it was very inscrutable how one could become one of those noticed people. And my recourse was to just be as prolific and self-surveilling as possible. And so in art and these other things, video that I do, I don't have a sense that I need to be thinking of like the other 22-year-old MFA students and what they're making and how to make mine. I don't, what I do doesn't have to be better than somebody else's to make me happy that I've made it. I which I hope is not the same as, I just love sitting around quilting. Nothing wrong with quilting, but like, it's not like that I've utterly foregone standards, I hope, or even a wish for a kind of uh, bargain basement sublimity. It's just that it's a different, it's not contingent on the anointing of others, the way that I think coming of age and doing all that. But the exalted thing, it's very kind of you to say exalted. It's not my experience, and I think and I wonder this too about performers, many of whom, like you, Renee Fleming, others, all through the ages, exalt Callis, Garland, what the experience of a performer, a lionized performer's exaltation is like, and what therefore also the feeling of eclipse is like, which is a eclipse, like career eclipse, and which is which even can be, you could say, is, I think of the silent film star in the early sound star Rose Hobart, whom Joseph Cornell idealized and did a film about, who was turned down from a rest home, a retirement home in LA for indigent actors. She was turned down for being insufficiently famous.
Well, I think of a few things that haunt me, because if I have one cardinal flaw, it is that whenever anything good happens, I it, it is accompanied by an immediate fear that it will go away. And so I remember dating this mathematician, a grad student, um, and he loved this documentary about the guy who solved Fermat's last theorem. Okay, and it had been like 1,000 years, nobody had solved it. I think his name was Andrew Wiley or something like that at Princeton. And so at the beginning of the documentary, it's really quite remarkable. He's sitting in an office with just stacks and stacks of paper, and they're interviewing him. And they are asking him about the moment he realized he had solved this theorem, that would go on to be one of the greatest mathematics sort of discoveries of the last millennium, or not millennium, but 1,000 years. So, and he was talking about it, and he said, he kept stopping. He would be like, in that moment, when I realized that, and he kept stopping like that. And he said, I knew that nothing I ever did again. And then he just breaks down and cries. And you realize, you know, and that's how I kind of feel. I remember I got the poster. I mean, I just have to show you, because this is the kind of self-serving, bullshit that opera singers do. But I got the poster from Akhnaten, and I had to hang it in my bedroom, and I look at it when I wake up. I mean, you don't want to have, for anyone, you don't want to have a large poster of your face in your bedroom, because if people ever make it to your bedroom, they feel very weird about it. But in any case, I look at that, and I really, I don't look at my face so much, but I look at, there's a little banner over the top of it that says sold out, which doesn't, happen a lot at the Met. And that's really why I wanted that poster. And I think back, whenever I see it, I think back to being on the stage of the Met, and I would come on for the bow, after walking slow motion for 3.5 hours, and the audience would often stand up and make a lot of noise, and I would be there. And actually, you don't feel inflated. You feel kind of like a little grain of sand in a large desert, because it's so immense. It's such a big stage. It's so many people. And you feel like you're there in this tiny little square, and you're very, very small, and yet everybody is sort of like focused in on you. And then I would think back to Andrew Wiley in his office, and you think to yourself, like, well, it could sort of be downhill from here. And how do I reconcile with that as an artist? How do I think about retaining any kind of optimism, or any kind of drive, or any kind of will to continue flagellating myself daily in the pursuit of something that might surpass that, you know?
I want to hear more. There's so many things I want to hear. I want to hear more about some of the specifics of the flagellation because I haven't, and I think whoever is listening to this, but it might be all, since this is art form, it might be artists as well who are dealing with a kind of issues of exactitude, however non-material their practices are. And so I'm so curious about a few aspects of the self-flagellation, but I also want to hear a bit about New York Pops Up.
Yes. Um, well, okay. New York Pops Up is, I'm on the council of 12 artists advising New York State's initiative to bring back the arts. So we're just having an amazing time really reaching out through various networks and finding people who are creative and excited about putting art on the street. And we have a small-ish budget, but we get to pay everyone, which is very nice, and then make things happen for them and, connect them. And so we've been putting up, performances all over. And I've also been creating this initiative for the New York Philharmonic called the Bandwagon, which began as a little pickup truck on which we did 81 concerts in New York, if you can believe it, in August and September of all times in the pandemic. And now it's going to come back in May in this new and bigger and greater way, which I'm very excited about. Of course, I produce it. So it's not just that I ideate or I create it, but it means that right before this call, I was on with the head of whatever New York City park, trying to convince them to permit X, Y, or Z. So
You are so good at that. You are so good at that. Okay.
I do, I mean, I remember loving just naturally Machiavelli in high school, and so now I've recently bought the Power Broker to see if I can sort of go to a new level of that kind of operation. But yeah, so but that is its own kind of flagellation as well, because it requires a real commitment of, I'm not the kind of person who, after having dinner, then can settle into a chair with a book or watch a movie or something. I've got a whole lot of work to do before I can actually get into bed on most nights. And so, I think that's one kind of self-flagellation, in that I believe that an artist is the CEO of their own company, to be very American about it. And, that in this time, it is not that we could hand over something like the marketing, press, fundraising, whatever it may be, even the permitting, to someone else if we have a very specific vision. Now, if we find someone who can do it with us, that's a different story, but often there's not. And so there's that. But what I I think my own discipline with respect to that comes from the self-flagellation of singing, in which, as you alluded to earlier, and as Thomas Hemsley talks about in his book Singing and Imagination, which is an amazing, you should definitely read this book. It's about, singing is about teaching your body to do something in response to a finite set of impulses that come from your brain. And often there are 60 muscles in your throat. So often those 60 muscles, you have no idea what they look like. It's not like a bicep or something that you can imagine how it works by looking at it. So in order to get it to repeat what worked one day, just thinking, oh, I should do that, doesn't work. And really, the only thing that works is to create an image, in my experience. Let's say it's a flower opening, and that image then causes your brain to send a certain set of impulses to the muscles, and the muscles respond to those impulses in a certain way, only with repetition, only when you do it enough so that you get the same physical result from an image. So that's an interesting kind of dance that I think a lot of us opera singers are looking at. I mean, opera is kind of the Olympics of singing in a way, in that it uses the body to the far extreme of what is possible, both in terms of the two vibrating pieces of gristle that reside here, but also in terms of the breath that fills up your lungs and then displaces your diaphragm, and the way that that breath travels through the vibrating gristle into the cavities of your head and your face, which means there's a whole other set of things both inside your mouth and in your cheeks and all of this that you can manipulate to change the sound or the shape of a vowel or that kind of thing. So it's actually quite a complex physiological endeavor.
It is. It's just mind-boggling, and also it's what a talk about necromancy. I mean, what I love about the Olympian feat of singing that you do is that you are the master of this rich laboratory of effects and levers, most of them invisible, as you say, and all that all have to be exercised under the most frightening forms of pressure and stage fright. So I kind of, it's enough live performance, though I do my own forms of performance live. This is a performance too. This is like the Met. Like now this is as in a way as exacting as it gets. I don't have to do forms of performance that involve that level of exposure and that set of pre-scripted standards of what it's supposed to sound like, or have that many collaborators. How do you actually, how do you thrive and how do you not thrive under those series of pressures? You clearly thrive. It works for you, and you seem to be a happier and more efficacious and joyful practitioner of all aspects of the operatic art than most people ever born. I mean, you make Beverly Sills seem like, you know, the Wicked Witch of the West or something. Margaret Hamilton, that's it. I mean, you're just really, but you are not Julie Andrews on the other. I mean, you're a mischievous guy. But I guess what I'm asking is just like, how in the world do you deal with like taking a breath and all this stuff in public?
It can be daunting, especially an onset feels very daunting. The onset of tone, what we never refer to as the attack of tone, but rather the onset of tone.
I'm saying attack, like when you attack a pianissimo.
Well, then you get these reviews like I saw someone reviewed once that, and it said, I think she's got a great career as a paint stripper or something like that. So, but I think that the onset has always been terrifying for me. And also, I was singing on Sunday at the Guggenheim, and it happened to be Easter Sunday, and so I decided I was going to sing Agnus Dei from Bach's B minor Mass, and it has such incredible long lines, and you take in a breath and you think, oh shit, how am I going to make it through? But then what happens is everything sort of migrates upward, even just and the tighter and the more high you get, the less room you actually have for air. So what you have to do is remind yourself to go against the impulses of nature.
I imagine that successful performance happens within an environment where you are all learning unconsciously from each other these forms of strategies that permit a lifelong career, where in a way that if you just ask somebody on the street, do you want to go do this thing in an HD in front of 500,000 people and be naked maybe too, and it's an onset and it's Handel and you better not blow it. Nobody ever would do that. But if you're in a kind of a community where there's a lot of sort of peppy understandings that life is difficult and that we have ways of brightening and lubricating and
That's exactly right. And do you, to a certain extent, I mean, the other big part of your life is obviously teaching. I mean, do you get the same kind of constant renewal or, revamping of things or revarnishing of things from a student or from your students that bring you into a different place with your own work?
I mean, I think because writing is so solitary and I have to show up somewhere to remain a human being. I really do. And I do, and so I have, and I'm glad, I feel very lucky that the place I show up to for my livelihood is a very stimulating form of teaching of advanced students in subjects I love that I can choose. And I won't say I like young people, but I do love, because I like old people too, into whose ranks I am ascending very quickly. But I like other people's ideas a lot. And I like the stimulation of reciprocity. And I like to be excited by others. I'm maybe socially a little passive, meaning that I don't seek out others very much. But when I'm with somebody else, I feel quickened and brought to a higher place, as opposed to my baseline nature is sunk into sunk into inwardness.
Sunk into, oh, there's so much stuff that I know we're now having to wrap up, but I just want to say sunk into yourself is a very interesting image for me. But the other that really resonates is the stimulation of reciprocity. Because I think about, like on a gay dating app, a lot of times people ask questions like, "What are you into?" That strike me as very banal, or "What are you looking for?" Um, and um, and I often say something like, "Well, it depends what I find." But I think the real answer is stimulation. The stimulation of reciprocity is what we are, as artists and human beings and physical bodies, kind of, that's really what we find exciting, and that is the communication and the community, and it is the solitary act of writing in a way, because it doesn't happen in a sous vide world, but it does kind of, you imagine, I guess, that it stimulates some kind of reciprocity on some level.
Yeah. I just think you're so marvelous, Anthony. I've always wanted to know opera singers, and I really have very rarely in my life even asked for an opera singer's autograph. And I think it's so wonderful that the opera singer that I actually know, I've known a couple of others here or there, but none like you, is that you seem to be unique among performers, period, not just opera singers. The velocity and authenticity of your joie de vivre and your curiosity about making new forms of art happen, and your interest in making sure that it happens and that it happens well, and the absolute originality of the kind of singer you are and the kinds of effects you produce. There have been countertenors, but that the way you are a countertenor is absolutely unique. And I don't think it's even countertenorness per se that's the thing you have. It's a new form of gleam.
Well, thank you. I will take that to the grave with me for sure. And similarly, I mean, I was so excited to meet you in Chelsea that day we first met when we were young, and because I felt so immediately understood by your work and continued to feel that way. And so I feel a similar kind of disbelief in the overwhelming joy of having you in our universe, but especially in my universe. So I've cherished having this time together to talk about various things. And as I said to you, I hope that this is a precedent, and that all of our conversations are now recorded for posterity in a public forum.
Except we'll have our postmortems that won't be recorded.
Yes. Well, that'll make people very aware of what they're missing, which I enjoy.
Okay. I'll see you on stage soon.
And I will see you at dinner soon, I hope.
Okay. Bye.